Anybody have parents that were like mine, that were wonderful, loving parents, but they had a propensity to leave you at places on accident? Anybody else have that experience? Anybody? Yeah. I'm pretty convinced that if CPS were a little stronger when I was younger, I may not be a Pollard today, because my parents had a propensity of leaving me places. I was the third child, and I have a third child now, and so I understand what that's like. We had a birthday party for poor Adam yesterday. You know, when Luke, our oldest child, was born, every year it was like, you know, a coronation, big fanfare leading up to the first birthday party. You send out matching invitations. I mean, everything's got to be perfect. Balloons have to match. You got to have clowns. You got to have jump houses, whatever. And like a week ahead of time, we're like, oh, Adam's turning 3 next week. What should we do? You know what I'm saying? And so we decided, well, we'll just go to the park for free. Well, then it was going to rain. And then we're like, well, we don't really send out invitations, so we'll go to Bouncing Bears. And we went to Bouncing Bears yesterday, and the birthday boy didn't bounce on one of the jump houses. It was unbelievable. If you don't know what a Bouncing Bears is, it's just a room full of awesome jump houses. And he wouldn't get on any of them, you know. And then we're like, hey, afterwards we'll just go have lunch at Wendy's, you know, because nothing says special birthday like a 6-pack of nuggets, you know. And so we got him some Wendy's. But my parents, you know, growing up, we used to play softball, slow pitch softball all the time, and we played at different parks. But we used to play at this church called Memorial Baptist, and Memorial is kind of it's in the Aldine area, and there was this big like ditch or gully, bayou, I don't know what it was, beside it. And so as my parents would play softball, me and my brothers would go down in that ditch, and we loved it when there was water flowing through it, because we decided we were going to build a dam. Anybody ever had that? You know, you're at a river or something, and you're just convinced as a kid, I can take enough rocks to put it in this little water and stop it up. You ever had that experience? So we'd take the rocks and we'd throw it in, and we'd get so frustrated when the little dam that we built up would eventually just be knocked over by the water because we didn't have enough rocks. Well, fast forward now from my childhood days, and the reason I shared that story was one night we were down in the bayou, and my mom and dad had taken separate cars to the baseball field, and they both left me down there in that big old ditch. They didn't know that Robby was missing because he's the third child, and who cares really, you know? Any other third children in here? You're the third child? Lauren, I know, I feel your pain. Anybody else? Okay, so none of you understand what it's like to be the third child, but, you know, anyway, so they left me down in that ditch, and then I'm out on this huge softball field, and then they turned off the lights. So I'm standing in the middle of the softball field. It's pitch black, and my parents are nowhere to be found. And then, you know, 10, 15 minutes later, they come screeching through the parking lot like, we're so sorry. I'm like, I don't believe it, because last Sunday you left me at church sleeping on the front pew. So, you know, there was something about that. But anyway, that's kind of my childhood experience. We'd go down in that bayou, and we'd try to build up a dam. Well, then a few months ago, we took our kids to Pedernales Falls in Central Texas, beautiful park. And I was amazed at how my kids are just like me. You know, now Pedernales Falls has this river, I forget the river that's running through it, and they just decided that we're gonna get down in the water. It's really cold, and I want to apologize to all the people we baptized on Easter Sunday. The water was really cold, and so I apologize for that. But anyway, they got down in that river, and Noah decided, my middle child, well, I'm going to dam up this water. He's like, Dad, let's build a dam. And so we started putting rocks out there. Well, we'd put them on, and this river would just knock them over. And Noah got so frustrated, and he said, we need bigger rocks. And it's very true. But in the middle of the river, there are these huge boulders. And the water doesn't affect those boulders like it does the little pebbles or the rocks that we were putting out trying to stop the river. And when Noah said that, it made me think of the reality that we do need bigger rocks in our lives. Wouldn't you agree? When we look at the culture that we live in around us, we need some bigger rocks. And I'm not talking about people that work out, people that, you know, are getting stronger and faster. I'm talking about rocks in our culture. And I want to study one family. It's my favorite story in the Old Testament, and there's my favorite Bible character. I want you to find the book of 1 Samuel if you have your Bible. If you don't, that's okay. We're going to have it on the screen, but we're going to take kind of a break. We've been doing a series that we've been calling Frequently Asked Big Questions, and I want to encourage you to come back next week for that. We'll be tackling some of the big issues and questions that people have. But today's Mother's Day, and I actually want to study a story of a mom and a family. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 is where we'll begin. And although we're not going to talk about big questions of life, they actually had a big question. I think it's something that might speak to us today. But at this point in the book, when you get to the book of 1 Samuel, you have the Old Testament, what's called the nation of Israel. They were just a nation. They were God's chosen people. And you find the nation of Israel in this time of a spiritual low. It was as low a point in the history of the nation that they had been. If you look in 1 Samuel chapter 2, you'll find that the priesthood, the people that were supposed to be representing God, they were completely corrupt. They were taking the sacrifices that people were offering to God, they were taking the money that was offered to God, and they were using it for corrupt things. They were using it in ways that God said wasn't right. Throughout the nation, you had the Ark of the Covenant, which was like the symbol for the nation of Israel, that God's presence was with them. Later on in the book, we find that the Ark of the Covenant was taken. The Philistines got it. They defeated the Israelite people. And so you have the nation in this real spiritual low. The nation of Israel at one time had been a very God-fearing people. They were the people that, you remember in the movies when Moses, they crossed the Red Sea. This is the same group of people, but now, rather than worshiping the God who had helped them cross the Red Sea, now there's idolatry throughout the entire nation. They're worshiping false gods. They're not worshiping the true God. And so this entire nation is just this flood of immorality and evil and corruption on every level. The judges of the nation, the people that have been set apart from the people to judge the people and to judge political and social issues, they were corrupt. So there's this flood of corruption and evil and immorality and godlessness within this country. And we're introduced to a woman in 1 Samuel chapter 1 who, in the midst of this huge cultural struggle, now has her own individual struggle. Do you see the parallel between our culture and the culture of 1 Samuel? Where there's just a flood of immorality. There's just a culture of godlessness that's all around us. It's in the movies, it's in the music, it's in the TV shows, and more we're getting away from God and we're getting away from the biblical truths that we have believed. It's the same type of culture in 1 Samuel. And in the midst of this culture, you have one woman who's struggling with a very deep issue. If you look in verse 2, she was barren. Here's a woman who's not able to have any children. And her barrenness actually led to her husband finding another woman so that he could have children. Now, just want to take a little side note here. The Bible does not teach polygamy, having more than one wife, although it does talk about it, that people took more than one wife. And a lot of times that would happen when a woman wasn't able to bear children, because in those days the family name meant a lot. And so you have this husband who has a wife, and he's not able to have children, and so likely he takes another woman so that he'll have descendants coming out of his family line. And this woman, her name is Hannah, is really struggling with her barrenness. She feels like that God is oppressing her, and she has this question of, God, why is it that I can't have children, and yet this other woman that is a constant adversary in my life can have as many children as you want? In fact, if you look down to verse 6 and 7, it says this other woman, it left her provoked and irritated. Have you ever been irritated at something about God? Like that God let you go through something, or He allowed something in your life and really it just rubbed you the wrong way and it left you feeling irritated. Well, that's how she feels. And in verse 7, it was affecting not only the way that she felt, but it was actually affecting her physical health. She was weeping and she would not eat, and her problems were exacerbated by a clueless husband. And every woman in the room, when I read this verse, is going to say amen. This is really great. So you have Hannah, who can't have children. She's irritated about it. It's provoking her to the point where she's weeping and she won't eat. She's sick to death that she can't have children. She wants children so bad. And then listen to this wonderfully understanding husband. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why are you crying? Huh? Any women ever have your husband ask that? Why are you crying about this? Okay, so he continues. And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? Brilliant. You don't need babies. You got me, baby. You know, who makes a statement like that? Why are you so sad about not having kids? Having me is better than having 10 children. I want to say to all the men, never, ever use that line on your spouse. If she says, you know what, I'm kind of tired of the house, I'd like to look at a new house. Don't say, why do you need a new house? You got me. I'm better than 10 houses, baby. No, never use that line. So here's a woman who's struggling deeply with her problem with God, and yet a husband who doesn't understand her situation is making the problem worse. Have you ever been in that point where you're struggling with something and people are trying to speak into your life, and you're listening to what they're saying, but they just don't get it? They don't feel the pain that you're feeling. They don't understand the struggle that you're going through in your life. As we studied the story of Mary and Martha the last couple of weeks, Mary and Martha, you remember their brother Lazarus died, and when Jesus came, they were really struggling with understanding why. They had sent word to Jesus and said, Jesus, Lazarus is sick, why don't you come and heal him? But Jesus didn't come, and while Jesus wasn't there, Lazarus died. And so when Jesus finally came and Lazarus had been in the grave 4 days, Mary and Martha came to Jesus and they said, Jesus, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. In other words, God, why is it that you didn't come when I was crying to you? So here's a woman that for years has been coming to God and asking Him for children, but yet God hasn't answered in the way that she wants Him to answer. And I said last week, talking about Mary and Martha, and I think it's really important to reiterate it here. Every struggle that you face in your life, and you're going to see this in Hannah's story today, is a battle for your faith. When you lose your job, it's not a battle between you and your company. It's a battle for your faith. When your marriage is struggling, it's not an issue of your marriage. It's a battle for your faith. Are you going to turn to God, and are you going to trust Him that in the midst of circumstances that you don't understand, are you going to really trust that God is who He said He would be? So here's Hannah struggling through her issue. And in the midst of this world of circumstances, a nation that had turned its back on God, and undoubtedly as a godly woman, she didn't understand why the culture was so corrupt. And in the midst of her own struggle, she goes to the temple. She went to God. Look at verse 10 of 1 Samuel chapter 1. And she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Hannah was an incredible woman of faith, even in the middle of circumstances that she didn't understand. She begins her prayer, if you notice the first few words, she said, O Lord of hosts. And then we find her faith summarized in one word, and this is going to sound really weird to you, but she said, O Lord of hosts, and here's the word that summarizes the faith of Hannah. If you will listen to my prayer, if you will give me a son, I will give him to you all the days of your life, of his life. That word if is what summarizes the depth of Hannah's faith. And you might think, well, how could we say if is a word to describe faith? Because the word if describes uncertainty, doesn't it? I mean, the word if seems like we're saying it could happen, but it couldn't. You know, if I stood up before the church and before my family and friends and told my wife 13 years ago that I was going to marry her and I would be faithful to her if I wanted to the rest of my life, she'd say, that's not the kind of certainty that I'm looking for when I put the ring on my finger. No, I said, I'm going to be faithful to you, and I'm going to make that promise. And here's Hannah coming to the Lord, and it doesn't sound like faith. If means uncertain. The word if means I'm not sure, and it does. When Hannah came to God, she said, if you will do this, I will give my child to you all the days of my life, of his life. Let me help you with faith for just a minute. Faith in God is not built upon what we assume God will do. Our faith in God is not built upon what we want God to do or what we think He will do. Our faith in God must be based upon what we know God can do. This is what you see on TV a lot. Here's the idea of faith that you hear people on TV when they're talking about God. They would say this: if you want something in your life, you just name it and you can claim it. That's not faith. That's assuming something upon God. You hear people saying that if you'll believe hard enough, then God will bring it to pass. And that is simply not what the Bible teaches. Your faith in God must not be based upon what you think God will do. Your faith in God is not to be based upon what you assume God will do. Our faith in God is rooted in what we know God can do. That is the basis of our faith. When Hannah addressed God, she simply prayed this: if you will give me a son. And although that seems uncertain, she's actually asking in faith. God, I know what you can do. I know what my body is saying I can't do, but God, I know that if it's your will, you could give me a son. That's faith. When Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother had not died, notice in John chapter 11 and verse 22, she said this, but I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give it you. In other words, I don't understand why you didn't come and Lazarus is now dead, but I know this, that whatever you ask from God, He will do it. If it's your will, God, I want it to be done. There were 3 Hebrew children later in the book of Daniel. You might know them if you've heard the story. Their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were in Babylonian captivity when the Israelites were then under the captive empire of Babylon. And the king Nebuchadnezzar had an image made of himself. And so you have 3 godly children being raised in a godless culture, a flood of godless culture. And the law came out that when the trumpets would sound, everyone in the nation was to bow down to the image of Nebuchadnezzar. But those 3 Hebrew children, they refused. And they said, we're not going to bow down to false gods. In the midst of this culture, you have kids standing up and saying, no, not me. I don't care what's popular. I don't care what everybody else is doing. I'm going to stand for what I know is right. I'm going to stand in faith in God. They were arrested. They were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar said, the law states that when the trumpet sounds, you're to bow down. And this is what the 3 Hebrew children said. And I want you to hear their faith. They said this, the God who we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. If they didn't bow down, they were going to be thrown into the fire and killed. And they said, we know that the God we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. But then they said this, but if He doesn't, know this, that we will not bow down and serve false gods. Did you hear the faith? We know what God can do, but if God doesn't do what we know He can do, we're still going to trust Him. That's where faith really rests. I had a friend of mine that we were on a hike and we were driving out in California to Yosemite, and we were talking about a family member. It was his grandmother. And he began to share about his grandmother, and she had fallen really ill and she got cancer. And so we were just talking a little bit about it, and long drive to get to the park. And then he said something, and at that moment I said, okay, we got to talk about this. He said, I've gone to my grandmother's bedside time and time again, and I prayed to God, and I said, God, heal my grandmother of cancer. But God is not answering my prayer. And when I'm praying in faith, and I'm claiming it, and I'm saying she's going to get well, and she's going to get better. And I said, look, there is a chance that your grandmother is not going to get better. That may be what God allows, but what you have to do when you say you're praying in faith, you're not saying I'm praying in faith and I'm going to say it's mine and I'm claiming it. You say, God, I know that you're able to do this, but if not, it's not my will, but yours that needs to be done. I had a friend of mine that just this past week did a funeral for a 5-year-old girl that died from leukemia. 5 years old. And this mom is struggling with the question of why, when they prayed so fervently for their daughter, did God allow this to happen? And he stood up at the funeral and he told them the same thing that I've been saying to you for the last few weeks. In the midst of circumstances that you don't understand, you have to realize this is a battle for your faith. Evil and suffering, the barrenness of Hannah, the death of a 5-year-old child, the death of a brother like Lazarus, every bad thing that happens in life is an effect of sin in the world. Sin has marred the creation of God. Every funeral that we attend is the result of sin. And God at any moment could intervene. But if He doesn't in the way that you want Him to, you have to still believe that God is good. You have to trust His character in the midst of circumstances that you simply don't understand. And here's Hannah praying to God, saying, God, I don't understand the circumstances that I find myself in, but God, if you will, my desire is to have a son. So when your grandparent falls ill with cancer, it's okay to come to God and say, God, if it's your will, I'm asking you to heal my grandmother. In the midst of that, you trust God, even when you're saying to God, if it's your will that this would be done. I said last week that we can't trust our circumstances. We have to trust the character and the heart of God. So when Hannah came to God and she prayed, "If you will, give me a son," she then followed that prayer with a promise. And that's where we see her faith. First of all, we see her promising to give herself. She said, "God, if you will give me a son," then she said, "I will give. I'm making a vow for myself." But then she also promised her son to God. She said, "I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life." And she understood an important principle that I'd like to share with every parent in the room today. And if you don't catch anything else today as a parent, catch this. Your children belong to God. That child that you gave birth to, or that child that you adopted into your family, those children are a gift from God. They are His children. When Hannah prayed to God and she said, "If you give me a son, I'll give him to you all the days of his life," in her prayer we see her faith. She realized that her son would not belong to God. The book of James says it this way, that every good gift and every perfect gift comes from above. Your children did not come just from your body. Your children came from the heart of God for you. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 127, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward." The contemporary English version says this, "Children are a blessing and a gift from God." They don't always feel like a blessing, do they? They don't always feel like a gift that you want to keep, like, "God, thanks, but here you go, you can have it back. I'll give that one back to you." But this acknowledgement in Hannah's prayer, not my kids, your kids I'm talking about. Okay, sorry about that. I wanted to clarify. This acknowledgement is the key to everything that you will face as a parent. Your children are a gift from God. They have been gifted to you, but ultimately your children belong to Him. It's important for you to understand that, because so many parents, I think, are making a fundamental mistake, and this is going to sound so weird to say, and I only have a 9-year-old, so I'm not a parenting expert, but please hear me on this. So many parents think that their goal in life is to push their children to be good kids, to grow up to be good students, to grow up to be good husbands, to grow up to be good employees. And it is important for your kids to be taught what is good. But I will tell you that I believe what the Bible teaches is that we're not supposed to be pushing our children toward good. We're to be pushing our children toward God. And if we raise our children and push them toward God, then all of the good things that we want in their lives surely will come flowing out of them. When I was in high school, I played baseball. I was not a very good power hitter, but I was more of a contact hitter. And by that I mean didn't make contact very much. But anyway, I was a pretty good baseball player in high school, and so I never really hit for power. I went my freshman through junior year, never hit a home run, never even hit the ball to the fence, I don't think. But on one Wednesday night, I just, I took a little extra Gatorade, I guess, before the game. And my second at bat, the first at bat, I grounded out. The second at bat, I came up, and dude, I hit a missile. I hit left-handed. I hit a missile to right field. And it hit just in front of the warning track and bounced over. The first ground rule double I'd ever hit in my life. I was like, this is unbelievable, I'm like the Hulk tonight. Next at bat, I come up, first pitch swinging, and hit it out of the park. My first home run over the fence. It sounds kind of weak saying that, but I mean, it's the truth. And my dad missed it. My dad missed it. You know why my dad missed it? The game was on Wednesday night. And on Wednesday nights, my dad was in church. And I remember at that game wishing that my dad had been there to see it. But as I look back on it now, I'm thankful that he wasn't there. I'm thankful that I was raised by a father and by parents who taught me that God is first in every part of our lives. In Little League, this is a true story. In Little League, my dad was a pastor. We made it when I was 11 years old. We made it 10 years old, or 10 or 11, I forget. Anyway, we made it past our district all-star game. And we made it into the regionals, if you're familiar with Little League. And my dad had the entire nationwide Little League shut down because he protested them scheduling a Little League baseball game on Sunday. Seriously, they stopped every tournament until that was resolved in the courts. My dad sued, clapping, that's weird. My dad sued Little League. Who does that? He didn't sue him, but he said, look, Sunday is a day that belongs to God, and we're going to be in church. And my dad was the coach, and he's like, I cannot miss church to play a baseball game. Who says that nowadays? You see, what's most important in our lives and in the life of your kid is not that they're a good student or a good athlete or that they're a good person. What you have to realize as a parent is that your primary role is not to push them toward that which is good, but to push them toward God, to lead them to God. And that's what Hannah was saying when she prayed. She said, Lord, if you will give me this kid, I will give him to you all the days of his life. I tell people about my boys if they ask. Sometimes parents will say, what do you think your kids will want to be when they grow up based on their likes and dislikes? And I kind of have an idea of what each of them would like to be, just based on their interests. But as a dad, the thing I pray more than anything else is that my boys grow up to follow Jesus in their life. Whatever they do, whether they play sports or whether they teach or whether they're a missionary, whether they're a business person, it doesn't matter to me what profession they choose. What matters to me most of all as a dad is that they follow Jesus all of their lives. And my responsibility as their dad is to pray just as Hannah prayed. God, you have blessed me with this child, and I will give this child to you all the days of his life. And no one will influence your children more than you will as a parent. Teachers, pastors, I guarantee you the way your children see you live every moment of every day will affect them more than 10,000 messages they could ever hear preached at a church. You influence your children more than any other person in their lives. So one of the most important principles of parenting is to understand the power of your influence over your child. So Hannah prayed, and she made a promise to God, and God heard her prayer. Look in verse 19 of 1 Samuel chapter 1. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord, then went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. We got Noah's middle name from this verse, Noah Samuel. We asked of God, and God gave us a child. And our child Noah belongs to the Lord, just as your children do as well. Just because God hasn't come yet in your hour of suffering, remember Mary and Martha, it doesn't mean He's not going to come. Hannah had been struggling with not having children for years, and God finally came, and she gave him a son. God brought the beauty from the ashes of her suffering. He always does, and He will for you as well. I always wanted to name a daughter Hannah. That was the name I had picked out. And then God gave me 3 boys. Noah Hannah didn't work too well, And then our friends started naming their kids Hannah, and then the root of bitterness came up in me, and so we're going to name the next one Ichabod. Okay, that's a nice biblical reference there. But anyway, when our second child came, we named him Samuel because this is a story that really resonates with my heart. Look at verse 24. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. And she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. And they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. He was the priest. And she said, O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. And she's referring to earlier in the chapter when she left the table, she went to the temple and she prayed, and Eli saw her. And she made a promise to God that she would bring the child to the temple. And then verse 27, For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. Hannah kept her promise to God. And we see something already starts to happen at the end of verse 28, and I want you to catch this. And he worshiped the Lord there. Who's the he? It's not Hannah. And it's not Samuel, who's just a baby. Who is it? It's Eli. Do you see what happened? Hannah's faith was influencing other people. She brought her child to the Lord, and her faith caused the priest to worship. In 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 21, the Bible says, "And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord." Why? Why was Samuel growing in the presence of the Lord? It's because his mom made a decision. His mom's faith was influencing his life. Then in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 26, "Now when the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man." So now Samuel's faith is affecting other people. Hannah's faith affects Eli, and then Samuel grows in the presence of the Lord, and then Samuel begins to influence people. Why? It's because Samuel's mom's faith was influencing him every moment of every day. You see, there was something else at play in this story that Hannah did not understand. When she was praying to God and saying, "God, all I want is a child," she didn't understand really what God was up to. In 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 31, Eli and the priests had absolutely desecrated the house of God as the priests. And God wasn't happy about it. And so God told Eli this, "Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house." God told Eli, "Because of the evil and sin I see in your life, I am cutting your family off from the priesthood." There will be consequences for your decision. But notice this in verse 35 of chapter 2, "And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever." Do you know who that faithful priest was? It was Samuel. Samuel was going to be raised up by God to replace Eli. And God said, in the midst of this culture that they didn't even understand, I was working in Hannah's life through her suffering, in her barrenness, to accomplish ultimately what I wanted to do. And that is to raise up a person who would lead God's people. Samuel grew up to be a prophet. And in 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 1, it says, "And the word of Samuel came to all of Israel." Why? Because his mom's faith was still influencing him as he grew up. God used Samuel to turn people away from false God. If you look in chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, Samuel told them, "Turn away from the false gods, turn away from them and serve God only." Why? Why was it that God was using Samuel to turn people away from false gods and to the true and living God? It's because of Samuel's mom. It was her faith that was influencing him. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, he became a judge over the nation. Why? Because Samuel's mom was influencing him. Samuel ultimately became the guy that would anoint David to be the king over the nation of Israel. The greatest king the nation ever knew was David. He was anointed by Samuel, who was used by God because his mom made a decision. And that decision was, "My child belongs to God, and I will give him to you, Lord, all the days of his life." All of this, if you get to 2 Samuel, the last chapter and the last verse, the nation of Israel turns back to God. And do you know why the nation of Israel turned back to God? Because God raised up a king after his own heart whose name was David. And David was anointed by Samuel the prophet. And Samuel rose to be the prophet because Samuel's mom made one decision, and that was to use the influence she had in her life, in the life of her child, to influence her child toward God. And all of the good from Samuel's life followed from that one decision to push her child toward faith in God. Do you understand what happened in the nation of Israel? God, in the midst of a river of corruption and evil and immorality and godlessness, He planted one rock in that river. And it wasn't Samuel. It was Hannah. And when Samuel came along, that rock that was placed in the river rested right up against Hannah as well. Hannah influenced her son, and her son influenced an entire nation. Do you really believe that, Mom and Dad, about your kids? Or do you just kind of resign yourself to say, you know what, America's going down the toilet? Or do you really realize that every child that you have in your life is a gift from God? And your responsibility as a parent is to influence them toward God, to teach them by your word and by your example and by your faith what it truly means to follow God. Influence is the key to parenting. Hannah influenced her son, and her son influenced the nation. And let me take it a little broader here for just a moment, for those of you that don't have children. Part of being a community of faith like Village Park Church, one of the parts I love about a church is that I am not the only person in my children's life that's teaching my children about faith in God. I love the fact that Charles and Hannah, who minister to our students, take my third grade student every week and teach them about God. I love the fact that Holly and others that are volunteering in our children's ministry are influencing my children toward God. And they're teaching them to be good and to do right things, but ultimately they're teaching them what it means to know Jesus and to follow Him with their lives. I love the fact that my children have an entire village of people who can help us raise our children to follow after God. Because there's going to come a time when my 9-year-old's going to be 17, and he's not going to want to talk to me about it. Right, parents? But I want my kid, if they can't talk to me about it, to have someone godly in their lives to influence them. So the message today is not just for moms, it's for everybody in this room. There's always another generation of people, there's always another generation of people coming up after you. If you're in junior high, there's a 5th grader in your life that's going to look up to you one day. If you're in high school, there's junior hires that are looking up to you. If you're in college, there are high school students who are looking up to you. If you're single, there are people that are in college looking up to you. If you're young married, there are people who are single or engaged that are looking up to you. And your job is to influence them toward God. Our job as a church is to influence this community toward God. What our community needs, what our church needs, is a people who will rise up with the faith of Hannah and say, we will leverage our influence on the next generation to move them toward God. So have you ever in your life made that decision to say, God, use my life to be influential in other people's lives to bring them to God? I'm going to just pray, and I'm going to ask us in our hearts to make that decision today. God, make us like Hannah. Recognize our influence and make the commitment today that for the next generation, whether it's our kids or just people in our lives, we will influence them toward God.